This is BBC News, building up to the coronavirus briefing from the government led by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The headlines. A change to travel rules. People arriving in England from more than 50 countries won't have to quarantine from next Friday. Spain, Italy, France and Greece are among the countries where restrictions have been relaxed. Portugal and the United States are among those that have not made it onto the list. The number of deaths in care homes in England and Wales from COVID-19 increased by 29,000 during the coronavirus pandemic, according to official figures. Boris Johnson warns people to act responsibly when pubs are allowed to reopen in England tomorrow. Also from tomorrow in England, the days of home hairdressing are over as salons get ready to open up. Hello and welcome to viewers on BBC One. Building up to the coronavirus briefing from the government, which today will be led by the Prime Minister. The government has published the list of dozens of countries that will be exempt from quarantine rules in England from next Friday. Reciprocal agreements have been reached, which mean travellers won't need to self-isolate when they return from abroad. The new system is for England only, with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland setting out their own approach in the coming days. From the 10th of July, passengers arriving from 59 countries and overseas territories will not be required to self-isolate for 14 days. Countries that are exempt from quarantine include Spain, Greece, Italy, Australia and New Zealand. Portugal is one of the notable countries not included on the list of travel corridors, as are the United States, China, India and Pakistan. Well, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has accused the UK government of shambolic decision-making. Tomorrow, the Foreign Office will change its advice, which had warned against all but essential foreign travel. Here's our transport correspondent, Tom Burridge.
En route to France by train, the Eurotunnel is still pretty quiet. But in a week from now, people travelling on this route back into England won't have to quarantine, and for this lot, that's good news.
It'll make a tremendous difference. We were over there recently, we came back and we had to quarantine for 2 weeks.
I'm going to go down to Paris today. I'm working down there, so the quarantine relaxing's big for me because obviously I'm back in work.
Most foreign trips during the pandemic were put on hold. The quarantine added uncertainty and bookings really dried up.
That really killed the passenger traffic. We were running at significantly lower levels than we have through the previous years, and this is the opportunity for people to get moving again.
The quarantine will still apply to people travelling to England from countries like the United States, where the virus is still not under control. But the government's blanket travel quarantine, in place for 4 weeks, will disappear for arrivals from more than 50 amber or green low-risk countries.
Countries on the list mean that when you arrive there, you won't have restrictions unless, and I should stress this point, they're on the green list. So those are countries who have very, very low incidence. We thought it was right to include them because, for example, I take New Zealand as a good example. They do have restrictions when you arrive, but we thought it was right to include them because people may want to come here from New Zealand.
Travel companies, which have suffered so much, say the quarantine should have only applied to risky countries from the beginning.
It's mainly for Europe we're seeing the interest at the moment, with some other people starting to look at 2021 travel from further afield, so that's very exciting. We'd still like to see some more clarity from the government as to what exactly is going to happen at the other end when people arrive in those countries.
But if you jet out of Inverness or any other airport in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, the quarantine rules might differ on your return. The Scottish Government wants more time to decide, as it has concerns about some of the amber countries on the UK Government's list of exemptions.
Just to illustrate the point about the shifting sands of the UK Government's position, the list of countries that they were yesterday demanding that the Scottish Government signed up to and suggesting that we were a barrier to getting agreement on is not the same as the list that they have shared with us today. So we need, as the Scottish Government, to analyse these proposals properly and rationally.
Testing passengers for COVID is also expected to begin soon at airports. A negative result at a lab like this one might mean even passengers arriving from risky countries could be exempt from quarantine. But you'd have to pay for a test. Tom Burridge, BBC News.
Well, the Department of Health has just released the new number of deaths and the increase that has been reported in the last 24 hours. The total number of UK deaths has risen by 137 to a total of 44,131. Let's speak now to our political correspondent, Jessica Parker. So, Jessica, once again, the nations of the United Kingdom not aligned on this lifting of quarantine for certain countries.
Yeah, so we've had this list in the last hour or so, the countries that should people from England choose to visit over the summer holidays, for example, they won't have to self-isolate when they come back, but it will, as things stand, just be for England. We heard earlier from the First Minister in Wales and the First Minister in Scotland, both describing the process that's led up to this announcement as shambolic. I think we expect to hear more about what they plan to do in the coming days. It is possible that they will largely follow, or to some extent follow, the kind of list that the UK government has set out, but highly critical of the process. Nicola Sturgeon suggesting that the list that was put to them last night was different to the list that was put to them this morning. Now, UK government sources are saying, well, look, if things are changeable, it is because this is an inherently changeable situation. But it is quite interesting to look at this list, for example, in terms of the countries where you won't have to self-isolate should you be coming back from them. Greece is on that list after a suggestion really this morning from the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, that it wouldn't be on this list. So I think there is a suggestion here that things have been chopping and changing a little bit. And it's quite possible, according to the government, that other countries will be added over the coming days. Portugal not currently on this list, for example, which might raise a few eyebrows.
Jessica, for the moment, thank you very much. We'll speak to you again just before the press conference with the Prime Minister at 5 o'clock. Raffaele Trombetta is the Italian ambassador to the UK and he joins us now from the embassy in central London. Ambassador, welcome. How important is it for you that Italy is on this list that the British government has released?
Well, good afternoon. Well, it's a good decision. It's a good decision for the travel industry, for the hospitality sector, but also for the people, you know, for British people, English people, Italian people coming to the UK. So it's a good decision for, as I say, for both countries. I do hope that British people will come and see Italy and spend holidays and enjoy their time in Italy. As I do hope that Italians will come back and enjoy their time in England.
But Italy is categorised as an amber country, which means it has a higher level of risk from COVID-19 than a green country. How equipped are you to cope with mass tourism this summer?
Well, we have set a very efficient monitoring system at the regional level, with data also that will be processed also at the national level. Of course, people and tourists coming to Italy, they will have to respect, you know, all the measure, the 1 meter, the social distancing, wearing masks when they go in enclosed space, you know, all the sanitary precautions. And as I say, we will be monitoring the situation on a daily basis. So we feel quite confident that people that can come and feel safe. And then if there is any need, we will take the necessary measures.
But it won't be a normal holiday in Italy with the usual freedoms, will it, that people may have come to expect in the past?
Well, it will be as normal as you can get now. What we are also thinking and inviting people to do is that to not only consider, you know, sort of July and August months, but also September, October. There is a lot that we can offer, not only if you go to the seaside, but, you know, the beautiful cities that we have. There are also sort of golf tourism that we are trying to promote and other types of activities. So, yes, perhaps, you know, it's not as it used to be. It will soon be. And anyway, there are so many other things in so many places that you can do in Italy, and I'm sure you can enjoy it.
But in an ideal world, wouldn't you have waited longer to lift the restrictions? Because your schools aren't even reopening until September.
Well, it's two different things, of course. The school, anyway, our schools, they do reopen in September, and the government is taking all the measures to make sure that our children and our young people, when they go to school, they do that in a safe environment, as we are doing now for tourists. So I think it's the right thing to do. As I was saying, it's a good decision for people who are traveling, and there's millions of them traveling in the hospitality and the travel industry.
Raffaele Trombetta, Italian ambassador to the UK, thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Well, the British Prime Minister has urged people to act safely and sensibly when pubs in England reopen tomorrow. Restaurants, hairdressers and hotels are also among the businesses which are allowed to open from tomorrow, as long as they follow safety guidelines. Our correspondent Katie Austin has been finding out how businesses on the Kent coast have been preparing.
On Saturday, customers will walk through the doors of this small pub in Folkestone for the first time in 3 months. Social distancing means things will be different.
Hello, welcome to the Lifeboat. We've taken some tables away and spaced the seating over here. We've got a hand sanitising station.
With capacity reduced inside, the beer garden will be vital. But how many people will turn up?
I'm anxious. Some people are saying that we're going to be packed and they're worried that we can't get in, and then other people are saying that they're not going to be coming out to pubs or restaurants for a long time yet. So yeah, it's the completely unknown.
Unlike some pubs, this one won't take orders via an app, but it will be table service only.
The stairs will need monitoring at the top for entry.
Not all venues in England will open this weekend. This music bar won't. Its owners say without live music and with social distancing, they'd lose money.
It's devastating for us. There are days where we can cope and we can be really positive and we can look to the future and look at the ways that we can open in the future. But there are also some very, very dark days.
Businesses in Folkestone need trade from tourists as well as locals. Since Wednesday, staff at this hotel have been back from furlough preparing for guests.
So we will actually have a protective screen here. We are implementing a contactless and paperless check-in. We have to make sure all of our staff are properly trained to use PPE.
Brochures and cushions are being removed from rooms as multiple people could touch them, and there'll be no buffet at breakfast.
And we're going to have to start removing, some of the tables and chairs. At the moment, there is plenty of availability. So in a way, it means we can start slowly, make sure that actually we're comfortable, the staff are comfortable.
Also preparing to reopen from Saturday are hairdressers. This one's now booked up for weeks. Staff have been in trialling their expensive protective gear and the more sparse layout. Once again, excitement is mixed with anxiety.
Less clients in the day, but it's going to take more time because of all the cleaning in between as well. We can't not open, but just hope that we've done everything and we remain safe.
Some businesses have already closed for good, and for others the chance to reopen is crucial to their survival. With the furlough scheme winding down soon, many thousands of jobs will be riding on the success of the next few months. Katie Austin, BBC News in Folkestone.
Well, lockdown is easing across the UK at different speeds. Let's get the latest from our correspondents on changes coming into effect in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Joining us are Chris Page in Belfast, Thomas Morgan in Cardiff. But first, let's join Alexandra Mackenzie in Glasgow.
Well, the school holidays have already started here, and from today people can travel more than 5 miles for leisure and book into self-contained holiday accommodation. If you're under 12, it's okay to play with your friends outside without social distancing. For older children, you can meet up to 8 people outside, but you do have to socially distance. And if you've got an elderly relative in a care home, you will be able to go and see them from today, but under strict restrictions. And from Monday, open air hospitality like beer gardens and cafes will be able to open outside. But some parts of Dumfries and Galloway won't be able to enjoy the easing of restrictions because of a cluster of coronavirus cases. But the main thing at the Scottish Government briefing today was the UK Government's plans to ease quarantine restrictions. Now, Nicola Sturgeon said that the decision-making process was shambolic, and she would be taking time to make a decision for Scotland.
First Minister for Wales also echoing what the First Minister for Scotland saying, that the decision from the UK government not to keep the Welsh Government involved in those negotiations and let them know what the list of destinations for what no quarantine would happen from those destinations, utterly shambolic as well. But today the Welsh Government have said that from Monday, people from Wales, people from the cities can go further than 5 miles. Up until now in Wales, we've only been able to travel within a 5-mile radius. Stay local was the message here, but from Monday that will be lifted. So people can travel further, however they won't be able to take any holidays across Wales. The date for accommodation starting won't be beginning until the 11th of July. And the next restriction after that to be lifted, well, that'll be pubs and restaurants, but outdoor venues only. On the 13th, those will open for outdoor venues. Now, that announcement came yesterday and was met with a very mixed response from the industry. Many pubs and big hotel chains, restaurant chains saying that they really can't afford to open because they have a limited space and realistically they wouldn't be making enough money. So that's the situation here in Wales, that from Monday people can travel further after over 3 months of lockdown.
Well, here in Northern Ireland, it's a particularly significant day in terms of easing the lockdown. This has become the first part of the UK to allow pubs, restaurants, cafes and bars to reopen. The hospitality industry is back up and running. It's a huge day for the tourist industry, hotels back welcoming customers again, visitor attractions, the likes of the Giant's Causeway, for example, on the north coast, also able to host visitors once again. Now, the hospitality industry is a major part of the economy here. It generates about £1 billion in revenue, sustains 65,000 jobs. Therefore, it's being looked on as being a particularly important moment in the process of bringing Northern Ireland's economy forward after what's been an exceptionally challenging, of course, 3.5 months. So far, around Belfast city centre and other parts of Northern Ireland, the word is that things have been going smoothly. Bars have to follow certain social distancing regulations. For example, you can't have a drink without food indoors in pubs. If you want to do that, you have to go outdoors, but if you want to sit inside, well, you've got to order a meal. The live entertainment, the likes of bands, for example, that's being discouraged. And the social distancing requirement is 1 metre where appropriate measures can be taken to reduce the risk. Otherwise, it is 2 metres. So that move from 2 metres to 1 metre, according to people working in the sector, has been particularly significant in increasing the capacity of pubs and restaurants, but they still say it's going to be a major challenge for them to break even as long as social distancing requirements are in place. Otherwise, as regards air bridges goes, well, the Stormont Executive, the Devolved Government, considering what their move is on that. A decision is expected early next week, perhaps. And whenever you look at the figures in Northern Ireland, one of the reasons why Northern Ireland's been able to move ahead of the rest of the UK in reopening the hospitality industry is the fact that transmission of the virus is now at a very low level. For example, today, just 4 new cases, and over the last week or two, the average of new cases has been below 5 a day. However, also today, health authorities announcing there's been 2 more deaths linked to COVID-19. A reminder the virus is still circulating and still remains a danger.
Chris, thank you very much. Chris Page in Belfast, Thomas Morgan in Cardiff and Alexandra Mackenzie in Glasgow. Thank you all. Let's return to the news then that the government has published a full list of countries for which quarantine will not apply to people arriving back in England. We can speak to the CEO of Heathrow Airport, John Holland-Kaye. Mr. Holland-Kaye, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. What's your view of how the government has approached this?
Well, this is fantastic news. Exactly what we were calling for 3 weeks ago when the quarantine came in. And I think for those people who are able to go to a pub or restaurant tomorrow, you can raise a glass to Grant Shapps. He has saved our summer. Whether you're going on holiday overseas, you can now go ahead with your family. For all the millions of jobs in the UK that depend upon aviation, we can start to have visitors coming to the UK to help to support our jobs. This is really fantastic news. And I'm delighted the government has such a long list of countries that we can now connect with.
I think you said that in May, traveller numbers through Heathrow were down something like 97%. Now, clearly this is a big list, but it doesn't include some very popular destinations like Portugal and the United States. How problematic is that?
Well, it's a good start, but this is really only the beginning, and we need to start putting in place some plans for what we're going to do to connect some of the higher risk countries, such as the United States, so that passengers who don't have the disease from those countries can come here with confidence, and we can avoid having a second peak here. And the way to do that is to test people before they get on the plane. So we need to work with the governments in the United States and other countries to make sure we have a common international standard for health in aviation, so that people are tested before they get on a plane, they can travel with confidence and then travel freely. And I think the UK government has a perfect opportunity to take a lead in this. We're one of the biggest economies in the world. We have one of the biggest aviation markets in the world. And if we can get an agreement between the UK, the European Union and the United States on how people from higher risk countries can travel, that can quickly become a global international standard.
How patient are people going to have to be, though, when they set off from Heathrow and when they land at Heathrow? Nobody likes queuing, but surely the measures in place are going to make it a much longer-winded process than normal.
Well, the current measures in place will allow people going to those countries on the list published today to travel freely. So there won't be longer queues in immigration. We'll be able to get people through quickly, and the same with outbound travel. It'll feel very similar to the normal travel experience, with a few things that are added on to make sure people are kept safe. So wearing face coverings and regularly sanitizing your hands and things like that we are now doing in our everyday life. But travel will be as close to normal as possible, and people can get on with confidence and book their flights from today.
I believe you had begun trying to find 5,500 members of your frontline staff who are prepared to take voluntary redundancy. How does this announcement by the government change your need to let so many people go?
Well, we have not set a target for redundancy levels at Heathrow. In fact, we've been trying to protect frontline jobs. We have opened up a voluntary severance scheme to find out which colleagues would like to leave if the opportunity comes up. But I want to protect as many jobs as we can. The COVID crisis has been devastating for the aviation sector, and across the industry, about a third of jobs are currently at risk. And that's why today's announcement is so important for helping to protect more jobs than would otherwise have been the case. And we'll get airlines flying again quickly. It will protect jobs at airports. And of course, the summer season is the only time when many airlines and airports make any money. So the fact that Grant Shapps has opened up these air bridges today, before the summer holiday season starts, is fantastic news for everyone in the aviation sector and all the millions of people in jobs who depend upon that. So whether you're a language school about to welcome people from Italy, or you're working in a pub or a hotel, this is really good news to protect jobs across the country.
Environmental campaigners who are concerned about climate change will say we shouldn't go back to flying how we did. Will we ever, for whatever reason, go back to the levels of international travel that we saw before the pandemic?
Yes, we will. And in fact, aviation is growing across the world. And in many countries, of course, aviation is only just starting to develop. In places like India and China, it's still where the UK was back in the 70s and 80s, and they're going to still keep on growing. And the real challenge we have is, how do we decarbonize aviation? And the answer to that is to move from fossil fuels to sustainable aviation fuels. And I was really delighted to hear the Prime Minister speak earlier this week about plans for a hydrogen-powered plane built in the UK. That'll be transformational so that we can all travel without guilt. But most of all, before then, we need to focus on developing at scale synthetic fuels in the UK, combining hydrogen and captured carbon, so that we can avoid having fossil fuels producing carbon into the air. That's something that we can scale up relatively quickly. It will mean that we can start to decarbonize aviation within the next decade. And I hope that the government will put their power behind this, put some investment into it, so that the UK can take a lead in decarbonising the aviation sector.
John Holland-Kaye, CEO of Heathrow Airport, thank you very much.
Thank you. Downing
Street has said that pubs will be allowed to open 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. You'd really need a drink, wouldn't you, if you were queuing up at that time. In today's briefing, in just a few minutes' time, the Prime Minister is expected to urge the public to act safely and sensibly. The pub industry said that reopening was fantastic and urged customers to respect staff and changes that are in practice. Let's speak to Fiona Hornsby. She's the owner and landlord or landlady, I don't know what you are these days, at the Bridewell pub in Liverpool. Fiona, what are you, landlord, landlady? Can we hear her? Oh no, we were so excited to be speaking. Fiona, she's come back to life. The picture's now moving. Fiona, tell us a bit about your pub. It's quite an unusual building, isn't it?
Our pub, it's an old Victorian lock-up, so it's actually very well suited for social distancing.
Yeah, and people, if they don't behave, you've probably got a key you can turn. Tell us how excited...
We've got...
Say again?
Yeah, we're super excited. Can't wait to get open. It's been a long few months and we're super excited to get back to work and see everybody, see all the customers, listen to their lockdown stories as well as share ours with them. It
must have been a very eerie sort of experience for you, sort of pooching around a building like that on your own.
It was incredibly strange. I think the panic when it first happened and what was going to happen, we didn't know. We had a cellar full of beer. We didn't know what we were going to do with it. We didn't know what to do with the staff. The government's money obviously was life-saving, and it really, really helped us out. But coming in every week, doing cleaning the lines and running the water to make sure we didn't get Legionnaires, and yeah, it was eerie and a bit sad when there's nobody in the pub. It kind of loses its atmosphere.
What time are you opening tomorrow? You can open from 6 o'clock.
Yeah, no, we're not opening at 6 o'clock. We're opening at noon, high noon.
And what have you got planned for people? What should they expect? Because it won't be the same sort of experience as before the restrictions came in.
No, it won't. And I think everybody's worried it's going to be very, very clinical, and we're trying to make it not clinical. We've spaced out all the furniture. Obviously, we've got hand sanitizer everywhere. I think the hard part is a lot of people like to stand in a pub, and they're not going to be able to do that for a long time yet. So that'll be a bit strange. But we've tried to do the best we can to make it as much as it was before, because we're very kind of friendly in here and the regulars all talk to each other, so it's going to be a bit strange, but we'll just get used to it. We have to, and we want to, and I'm sure the customers will work with us as well, because I think they want us back, not just us, but all the pubs back. They want us back, don't they? So it's we'll just have to get used to it.
Now, some sorts of beer goes off, so how difficult has it been getting hold of all the supplies you needed?
It was interesting. All our suppliers have been absolutely fantastic, because they've replaced a lot of the beer that we had in the cellar that went out of date, which has been brilliant, and obviously it's saved us a lot of money. The supply chain's kicked back in. It's been fine. We do a lot of cask beer in here, and it's been a bit more difficult to sort of get the range that we would normally have. But because brewers have started brewing their core range rather than any specials like they usually do. So we've just, bought what we can, and I think people will just be happy to have a pint.
I think you're absolutely right. What's your advice though to customers?
We're just going to ask them to behave, be quiet, and we'll just have to manage them. We're used to dealing with difficult situations all the time, and if somebody starts wandering when they shouldn't or annoying other people, we'll just guide them back to their seat and make them sit back down again.
Liverpudlians say behave in a better way than anybody, I reckon. Fiona Hornsby at the Bridewell pub in Liverpool. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
We're expecting to hear from the Prime Minister very shortly at the press briefing, but Jessica Parker, our political correspondent, will be watching that with us. What are we expecting him to say, Jessica?
I think a lot of this is going to be about public health messaging on the eve of these restrictions being lifted in England. I think what has been particularly talked about, of course, is people being able to pop off to the pub from tomorrow in England, albeit with a lot of COVID-secure guidelines out there to help pubs try and do this in a safe way and ensure social distancing. But I think the Prime Minister very likely to urge people to be responsible because of concerns that people might rush to the pubs and social distancing maybe won't be observed, and then you could see some scenes that the government could then be criticised for. You might remember, of course, it wasn't long ago that Bournemouth Beach was packed out on a day of beautiful weather, and The Prime Minister was criticised by Labour for using what they described as flippant language in the lead up to that, which they suggested had almost sort of encouraged irresponsible behaviour. Of course, Boris Johnson very much rejected that, but I think the government will want to be seen to be putting out that message to say that people must be responsible because, of course, while ministers are very, very keen to start opening up the economy, lots of concern about the impact of coronavirus on jobs, it is a balance of risk because the more people venture out, the more possible it might be that the virus will spread, but it's a balance of risks that ministers just have to weigh up. And, of course, tomorrow, a big day for England as restrictions are eased in some areas.
Yes, and of course there is the option for localised lockdowns, which would be the last resort, but we have seen in what's happened in Leicester that it might be necessary.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we've seen that in Leicester, and it was talked about by ministers that localised lockdowns could well be possible if there were surges of the virus in some areas. Of course, there has been some criticism of the way that this has been dealt with, suggestions that the government was slow to act, that the local authority didn't really have the data that it needed in order to make a decision. But as you say, Leicester now entering that localised lockdown and legislation being put forward overnight to make that happen. And I think there might be some further discussion about that in this afternoon's press conference. Boris Johnson going to be joined by the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer, so Sir Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty. And I think it's quite possible, as we've seen in previous press conferences, that those two head scientists might be asked how comfortable they are with the easing of the lockdown going forward.
Yes, I suspect that there might be some journalists also asking about the criticisms from Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford in Scotland and Wales respectively, that they don't think that this has been thought through properly. A shambles, they've described it.
Yeah, so this is the policy for quarantine. So the UK government has published a list of 59 countries that, should you be coming from those countries, you won't have to self-isolate for 2 weeks from the 10th of July.
Jessica, let's join the Prime Minister, who's just arrived at the podium.
Good evening. Since I last spoke to you from this podium, we've continued to make progress nationally against the virus. We are now reporting regularly fewer than 1,000 new cases each day. The Office for National Statistics estimates that between the 14th of June and the 27th of June, the most recent period they have analysed, 25,000 people in the community in England had the virus, one person in every 2,200. SAGE assessed that the R rate, the average number of people each infected person passes the virus onto, remains between 0.7 and 0.9 across the UK. SAGE also assessed that in England the number of new infections is shrinking by between 2 and 5% every day. And while the number of people dying with coronavirus remains too high, the numbers do continue to fall. Now, of course, this picture is not universal. There are areas such as Leicester where the virus is still more prevalent than we would like. We always said there would be local outbreaks requiring local action. This is to be expected and will, I'm afraid, be a feature of our lives for some time to come. But that should not take away from the great progress we've made together as a country against this vicious disease. This progress is the reason why we've been able, slowly, carefully, cautiously, to ease the national lockdown. Without doubt, lockdown has saved many hundreds of thousands of lives. But it has also had a devastating impact on our way of life and our economy. And of course, lockdown has not yet been lifted entirely. Indoor gyms, nail bars, swimming pools are still closed, mass gatherings are still prohibited, social distancing is still essential. I want these restrictions to be lifted as soon as possible. Of course I do. We've established task forces to work rapidly and closely with the sectors that remain closed to explore how they can be COVID secure, and I'm pleased to report that good progress is being made. Next week, we will set out a timetable for their reopening. Though, of course, I can only lift those remaining national restrictions as and when it is safe to do so. Our goal remains to enable as many people as possible to live their lives as close to normally as possible in a way which is as fair and as safe as possible. And to achieve this, we need to move away from blanket national measures to targeted local measures. So instead of locking down the whole country, we will lock down specific premises or local areas where the virus is spreading. Instead of closing down non-essential retail and hospitality nationwide, we will only shut establishments locally as required. Instead of shutting all schools for most pupils, from September, we will only shut those schools where it is absolutely necessary to control an outbreak. And instead of quarantining arrivals from the whole world, we will only quarantine arrivals from those countries where the virus is sadly not yet under control. We're already implementing this targeted approach in England. In Weston-super-Mare, we identified an outbreak in a hospital, closed it to visitors and new admissions, tested all staff and patients, and gave the hospital a deep clean. The outbreak was contained and the hospital is open again. In Kirklees, we identified an outbreak at a meat packing plant, shut down the plant, moved in a mobile testing unit, tested all employees, and traced the contacts of those who were positive. The outbreak was contained and the plant has reopened with additional safety measures in place. And of course, more recently in Leicester, we identified a community-wide outbreak which was not restricted to a single location, unlike Weston-super-Mare and Kirklees. Public Health England engaged with the local authority, mobile testing units were deployed, full data was shared, council-wide data was shared on the 11th of June, postcode level data was shared last week. This enhanced monitoring through additional testing showed that the infection rate in Leicester was 3 times the next highest infection rate in any other city in the country. So on Monday, the Health Secretary announced local lockdown measures in Leicester for an initial period of 2 weeks. In each of these cases, the problems identified were specific to Weston-super-Mare, Kirklees and Leicester. So of course, it made sense to take action locally rather than reimpose restrictions on the whole country. We're learning the whole time. With each local outbreak, we see what works well and what not so well so that we do better next time. Informed by our experience of these cases, we've developed an approach for controlling future local outbreaks which has 5 principal components: monitoring, engagement, testing, targeted restrictions, and finally, as a last resort, lockdown. First, monitoring. Public Health England, working with the Joint Biosecurity Centre, will examine carefully data on the spread of the disease and people's behaviour across the country. They will look out for emerging trends, rising case numbers and other indicators while taking into account local factors. Critically, we have made local data available to all directors of public health in local authorities so they too can monitor what's happening in their area. And local data will also be available to the public on the gov.uk dashboard. Second, engagement. If monitoring identifies local problems, NHS Test and Trace and Public Health England will work with the relevant local authority to develop a deeper understanding of the problem and identify solutions. Working with local agencies, we will seek to keep the local community informed at every stage so they know what's happening and what actions, if any, they need to take. Third, testing. We now have substantial testing capacity nationwide, and we have the ability to target that capacity at local areas in order to get a grip on emerging outbreaks. Scaled up testing at a local level, combined with contact tracing through NHS Test and Trace can control the virus and thus avoid more stringent measures. Fourth, targeted restrictions. If the virus continues to spread, we will restrict activities at particular locations and close individual premises. As in Weston-super-Mare and Kirklees, we will restrict access to places which become hotspots for the virus, while testing people who have spent time in those places and tracing the contacts of anyone who tests positive. Fifth, local lockdown. If the previous measures have not proven to be enough, we will introduce local lockdowns extending across whole communities, as in Leicester. That could mean shutting down business venues that would otherwise be open, closing schools, or urging people once more to stay at home. Local lockdowns will be carefully calibrated depending on the specific circumstances of each outbreak, and we are continually exploring smarter means of containing the virus. So that is the approach we will take as local outbreaks occur, and we will set out more detail soon. Let me end by looking forward to this weekend. Tomorrow, there will be a moment of remembrance for those whose lives have tragically been lost before their time. And at 5 p.m. on Sunday, the NHS's 72nd birthday, we can all come together to clap those who have worked tirelessly and selflessly to help the nation get through this pandemic. I know everyone will be looking forward to the relaxation of national restrictions. As lockdown eases, we should focus on supporting the livelihoods of business owners and their employees up and down the country, all of whom are opening their doors for the first time in more than 3 months. They are our local restaurants, hairdressers, libraries, museums, cinemas, and yes, pubs. They're also our hotels, B&Bs, indeed much of our tourism industry. All these businesses and their workers have put in a heroic effort to prepare their venues for this reopening, to work out a way to trade that keeps their customers safe. But the success of these businesses, the livelihoods of those who rely on them, and ultimately the economic health of the whole country is dependent on every single one of us acting responsibly. We must not let them down. Lockdown only succeeded in controlling the virus because everyone worked together. And we will only succeed in reopening if everyone works together again, because we're not out of the woods yet. The virus is still with us, and the spike in Leicester has shown that. If it starts running out of control again, this government will not hesitate in putting on the brakes and reimposing restrictions. Anyone who flouts social distancing and COVID-secure rules is not only putting us all at risk, but letting down those businesses and workers who have done so much to prepare for this new normal. So, as we take this next step, our biggest step yet on the road to recovery, I urge the British people to do so safely. Remember, don't gather in groups of more than 6 outside or 2 households in any setting. Keep your distance from those outside your household, 2 meters if you can, 1 meter with precautions if you can't. Wash your hands. Let's all stay alert, control the virus, save lives, and enjoy summer safely. Thanks. Do either Chris or Patrick have anything that you want to say? No? Okay, well, I think in that case we will go straight to our questions from members of the public and the media. And we've got a question first from David from Milton Keynes. David.
The event industry has been decimated by the restrictions put in place to combat the COVID-19 situation. With no end in sight for these restrictions, our industry faces a long period of enforced closure. Will the government offer any further assistance to the event and arts industry to ensure that it survives the next few months? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. And the events industry, the arts industry, the theatre sector, all of them have had an incredibly tough time. And I know how difficult it has been. What we've tried to do, David, is to support every sector of the UK economy, jobs, incomes to the tune of £120 billion so far. I know that particularly in the events and arts industry, people are anxious about when it's going to be their turn to unlock, and that's why I've announced tonight that we will next week be setting out a timetable so that we can get you all preparing, get underway, and make sure that we're working together to get your businesses as COVID secure as we can possibly make them. We'll be setting out a timetable next week, but David, the crucial thing is that we want life to get back, as I said, as fast as possible to as normal as possible, get the disease down so that the events and arts industry really have a chance of recovering. But you can also take it, David, that we will be doing everything that we reasonably can to support you, to support the arts, the theatre, the events world in the interim. Nothing from either Chris or Patrick. I thank you so much. Can we go to Hina from Leeds, please? Hina asks, there are fears of a second wave from doctors and those who are experts in the medical field. What are the contingency plans in place if a second wave was to occur? Well, I'm going to ask both Chris and Patrick to come in on this, but clearly that, a huge amount of work has been devoted to the possibility, of a second wave ever since the disease arrived in this country and indeed before, because our anxiety about the second wave has been very much at the forefront of our minds. We will obviously keep all sorts of measures in reserve, the local lockdowns that I talked about, the regional lockdowns, a national lockdown, of course, has to be, as it were, the response of the ultimate resort. We really don't want to do that again. We really don't want to do that again. So we will also be looking at other ways in which we can respond to the possibility of a second wave that reflect the vulnerabilities of particular groups and the prevalence of the second wave in certain areas, and we'll be bringing forward more detail about exactly how we propose to do that shortly. But I wonder whether Chris and Patrick want to say anything more about the second wave.
I mean, a second wave is something which everybody, I think, realises is a possibility, and in fact we're beginning to see the possibility of some second waves elsewhere in the world, and this possibility will exist with us for a very long time. So we have to prepare for that, and there's a lot of preparations going on. Clearly the best thing to do is to try and make that as unlikely as possible, and that's why the points that the Prime Minister was making about as the economy is opened up, all of us taking that extremely responsibly, sticking to the social distancing rules, sticking to the 2 metres if we can, 1 metre plus with mitigations if we cannot. All the other things that have been recommended, ranging from the simple things like washing our hands to using face masks on public transport, all of these things are absolutely essential. And if individuals, families, firms do not take them seriously, the probability of a second wave goes up very, very sharply. But there are, of course, also things, winter is one of them, which may work to the virus's advantage, even if we are, all of us, working incredibly hard. And we have to be ready for that possibility. And clearly there are plans, and as the Prime Minister says, they start off with dealing with local outbreaks, and then it is possible to gradually escalate. But what we want to do is minimise the chance and then deal with individual outbreaks as they happen.
Well, I completely agree. The key is to make sure that the COVID secure approach is across society. We all stick to it. It's particularly important as the measures are released now that we stick with the rules as Chris has described them. And that should be enough to keep this under control. But we'll still see local outbreaks. There will be an increase in local outbreaks. There's no question about that. And we need to be able to monitor and deal with those. And then we need to make sure that by keeping to the rules, we reduce any upswing nationally, and we try to make sure that as winter comes, which is the big risk, that we're prepared to be able to deal with it. So this isn't something that's gone away. It's something that's been suppressed, and we need to make sure that we keep it suppressed through living with the rules we've got for a more COVID-safe world.
Absolutely. The only thing I would add is if you compare our situation now, Hina, to where we were in February or March, there's two tools that we now have, possibly that we didn't have, or certainly that we didn't have back then. And one is, of course, the therapeutics that are now available, particularly dexamethasone, which was trialled and pioneered, whose use was pioneered in this country, which is effective to quite a large degree in reducing mortality, which is an important thing, and our drugs preparations will get better. But we also have NHS Test and Trace, which will assist in those that local crackdowns, those local lockdowns where we need to do them. But that doesn't mean we can be remotely complacent. As Chris said, we really have to be disciplined in order to get through this, and the virus is still out there, as Chris and Patrick have said. Let's go to Alex Forsyth of the BBC.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Tomorrow has been described as Super Saturday. Are you confident at this point that you've struck the right balance between the country's health and the economy? And are you confident you've got the right public messaging? And to the scientists, if I may, are you comfortable with the pace that this unlocking is progressing? And Prime Minister, can I put to you, the First Ministers of Wales and Scotland have described your travel quarantine plans as shambolic. Are they right?
Well, first of all, on the Alex, on the balance, it is incredibly important to get the balance right, and our priority is health. Our priority is the health of the British public and of our country, and we look at where we are with the prevalence of the disease down to 1 in 2,200 now. We look at the efforts that the public have made. We think that this is the moment, cautiously, to reopen the hospitality sector in the way that we're doing. But our advice to everybody is to respect the guidance, 2 meters or 1 meter plus mitigations, wash your hands, use face coverings when you're in a confined place amongst people that you don't normally meet. All those things are very, very important. And if we do that, I think we'll get through it, and we'll get our businesses, our hospitality sector back in the way that they want. And before I ask Chris and Patrick to come, I'll just say something on the decisions on quarantine and air bridges and how all that's going to work. Actually, I think we've trailed this for a very long time. Alex, we've always said that we would have a strong quarantine regime in place, and that's what we are going to have for large numbers of countries around the world, where I'm afraid the disease is still prevalent, or indeed becoming more prevalent. We're going to keep the 14-day quarantine system. There are some countries, and the list has been published today, where we have reciprocal air bridge arrangements. I know that administrations in Wales and Scotland, may have their own take on this. But my impression of the way we've been working as a UK is that we, generally speaking, we are following very, very similar paths, if at slightly different speeds. Anything you want to say on that?
I mean, the only in terms of pace, we really should be realistic that there are really serious risks on both sides of the path that we as a country, we as society, are trying to walk. Go too far one side, and the virus comes back again. Go too far the other side, and we get even further. And I speak as someone, this is a medical point, increases in unemployment, deprivation increasing, and all the social ills that go with that. So we are either side of the path we're on, there are risks, and we're going to have health problems and we're going to have economic problems for sure. So what we're trying to do is walk this narrow path. There is no perfect time. There is no perfect exact way of doing it. What this is an attempt to balance as best we can the multiple risks in a way that makes it possible for society to be as close as possible to normal whilst living alongside this virus, which we will have to continue to do. This virus is a long way from gone, but it's not going to be gone for a very, very long time. It's now a lot lower than it was. Currently, all-cause mortality is now back across the entire country at roughly the normal rate for this time of year. So this is a reasonable time to look at this balance and actually say, well, we're going to have to take risks whatever we do. And this seems a reasonable package of risks at this particular time, at this particular pace. But none of us believe, and I'm sure nobody watching this believes, this is a risk-free next step. It is absolutely not. And that's why we have to be really serious about it, wanting to support all of the businesses that are opening, wanting to support all the people who are wanting to meet loved ones, but at the same time, being really disciplined, all of us, about trying to do all the things that make it less easy for the virus to come back again, because these twin risks are going to be with us for a very long time.
And measure, get tested if you have symptoms,
yes.
Make sure that we track, we can understand and work out where outbreaks are occurring. That's what's key, so the test and trace is terribly important as part of this as we go into the next stage, and we need to measure in order to know what to do next.
Thanks very much. Paul Brand, ITV News.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You're asking people tomorrow to use their judgment, but what is your judgment? What is it that you want people to do? Are you saying that we all have a duty tomorrow to get out and spend? And to the scientists, it's one drink in a pub if you want to drive. Is it one drink if you want to safely socially distance, or can people think they can have as much as they want?
Thanks very much, Paul. Well, I think that my view, my urgings to everybody can be summed up in the phrase "enjoy summer safely." I mean, I do want people to feel that it's safe to go and enjoy themselves, to enjoy hospitality, but it's got to be done in a responsible way. The heads of parties got to give their name, contact details of everybody behind the bar, behind in the restaurant or wherever. Got to be done. Got to observe social distancing, wash hands, and this will be a success. If not, as Chris says, the risks are there and they're obvious. And I'm afraid that the risks are absolutely manifest in other countries that we know and love well, where there are difficulties, and we've got to look at that and think. We don't want to go down that route. There are ways of avoiding it. We can do it if we do it together. So enjoy summer safely.
And that applies also to alcohol.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Paul. Andy Bell, Channel 5. Andy. Can you hear us, Andy?
Yeah,
Thanks, sorry.
Apologies. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. We haven't managed to arrive at a UK-wide system for quarantine people travelling in and out of the UK. So what do you say to, say, a family in Scotland who say, well, we'll drive over the border into England, fly out of England, back into England, and get around any quarantine difficulties in Scotland? Would they have your blessing? Would you say that was perfectly fine? And for the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer, was there ever a medical scientific justification for the blanket quarantine we imposed back on June the 8th?
Well, first of all, Andy, I just really go back to what I've said earlier. I mean, I know that the DA, the devolved administrations in Scotland and I think also in Wales have a slightly different take on this. But my observation through the long weeks and months of cooperation on this is that the convoy is really going in very much the same direction, maybe at slightly different speeds. And I'm sure we'll get there together, and that common sense will apply.
I think on the second one, our advice has been clear that the quarantine makes most sense and can be used effectively when people are coming from countries with higher infection rates than the ones we have here. And that's where quarantine is a measure that would make a difference.
Thanks very much, Andy. Chris Smith, The Times.
Thank you. Firstly, can I just follow up, Prime Minister, on some of your comments this morning on cricket, which suggests that the scientific evidence you're getting suggests that the ball may not be such a vector of disease after all. And if so, and if everyone behaves themselves while having tea, can we get back to playing cricket soon? And then on tomorrow's easing, Sage papers out today identify bars and pubs as among the principal sources of super spreading events. So given that, can I ask Sir Patrick and Professor Whitty how concerned they are about what's going to happen tomorrow and what kind of surveillance measures need to be in place to make sure it doesn't lead to runaway chains of infection? And Prime Minister, Sage modelling also suggests that it's going to be touch and go getting all schools back in September, even if it all goes well, and that some other things, such as pubs, might have to close to allow it if people don't follow the rules. So are you telling the nation overdoing it tomorrow and during the summer risks children's education in the autumn? And if it came to it, would you prioritise hospitality or education?
Right. Okay. Well, let me go first on education. Chris, look, we're absolutely determined and resolved to get all pupils back in September. Gavin Williams, Education Secretary, has set out a very, very good plan for doing that. I urge our friends in the teaching unions to work with us, and let's do it. I think it's the right way forward. It's wrong for pupils to be out of school for so long. We can do it in September. We must do it in September, provided we all behave responsibly and keep the virus under control. Indeed, I would like to see, before the holidays in July, we're seeing more pupils now coming back in early years and reception years 1 and year 6. The numbers are coming up now, and that's great to see, and also years 10 and 12. We could have even more. Some schools are making it clear that, many schools make it clear that they have room for more pupils now before the summer holidays. I think it'd be a great thing if pupils came back now, as well as getting all pupils back. So the pupils that can come back, I should say, come back now, and all pupils come back in September. On your question about cricket, I just want to be clear that I wanted, having been stumped on the radio this morning on that point on the science again, and being asked about which was the exact vector of the disease. I've sought scientific advice and a medical opinion. The third umpire has been invoked, and what I can say is that we do want to work as fast as possible to get cricket back, and we will be publishing guidelines in the next few days so that cricket can resume in time for next weekend, or cricket can resume next weekend. I think that's what we're able to say today. But I wonder if I could ask Chris perhaps to just elucidate everybody just a bit more about the thinking behind cricket, the numbers, what the issue has been, because I think there are important questions people want answered about the transfer, the potential transfer of the disease in cricket.
Thank you, Prime Minister. On cricket, one of the issues on cricket is it brings together a much larger number of people in terms of linking households than you do the 6 people that is laid out as the maximum number of people who should be meeting even outdoors close now. But it is perfectly possible to have cricket where people do keep their distance. And provided people don't do things that are clearly not sensible, ranging from hugging the bowler if they've just bowled someone for a duck through to spitting on the ball, it should be possible to make the game itself really very safe, because it's an outdoor sport at a distance. It's not a contact sport in the sense that some of the high-risk outdoor sports are. There are, however, risks associated which we just need to think about and deal with, and these are perfectly manageable but the particular ones would be people going in afterwards in a crowded space, for example, in the pavilion to have tea or a beer. And this comes onto the pub issue. The biggest risks are when lots of people from completely different households are brought together in close proximity indoors. And whether that's in a pub or a cricket pavilion, that is a high-risk activity. And that's the reason why the really quite onerous social distancing guidelines that are going to cause a significant change to pubs and cause difficulties for many publicans, and we all recognise that, are so essential. There is no doubt these are environments whose principal job it is to bring people together. That's a great thing to do socially, but it's also a great thing from the virus's point of view. And therefore, we do have to have really clear and really disciplined approach to trying to maintain social distancing whilst also enjoying pubs. And this would be true in any other environment.
You're quite right to identify there are environments in which super spreading is more likely, and that's what why super spreading occurs. And those environments are indoor environments where people are crowded, they can't socially distance, and they're together for a long time, and you're connecting lots of different households, as Chris has said. So the answer is, don't let pubs become like that. Make sure you've got the appropriate COVID-secure environments and people can be distanced appropriately to try and reduce the risk. But whatever we do, the fact is that indoor environments which become crowded and people are there for a long time present a risk for spreading.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Kate Proctor of The Guardian.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You've said that you won't hesitate to slam on the brakes if the pubs reopening doesn't quite go to planned. Would you consider completely shutting pubs if you can see in a few weeks that this isn't working? Is that the kind of handbrake measure you're referring to? And secondly, your father travelled to Greece against non-essential travel advice. Dominic Cummings was seen to have broken the spirit of lockdown rules by travelling to County Durham. Why should the public obey all the rules that you're putting out at the moment on the pubs reopening when it does feel as though those close to you flout the rules?
Well, thanks very much, Kate. Well, first of all, on the episode in Durham, the Durham police made very clear that they weren't pursuing that. I'd make it a normal practice not to comment on the movements or doings of my family. But what I can tell you is that actually, when you look at what the British public have done over the last 3 months, it has been a phenomenal effort to follow the guidance and get this thing under control. And people have worked together and they've done an absolutely heroic job. And that's why we've got incidents running so much lower than it was only a few weeks ago. It's because of the collective efforts of the British public. We've got to keep that going now. I don't want to close all pubs at all if we have a further outbreak. What I've tried to say, I think you meant, do you want to close all pubs in the country? I don't want to get back to another national lockdown of that kind. We want to deal with local outbreaks, with local lockdown measures, and we're greatly assisted in our ability to do that by the test and trace operation. You've seen it work in Kirklees, in Ashford, Weston-super-Mare. We've had to do a big one now in Sheffield, but that is the approach that I want to take. But obviously, we have to retain all measures in reserve. I don't think there was a question for either. Thank you so much. Thank you. Harriet Line from PA.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You said today that people should wear face coverings in confined spaces, but many people aren't. So are you considering making them mandatory in shops, as has happened in Scotland? And to the scientists, do you agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg that pubgoers should drink a yard of ale to celebrate pubs reopening? And is there any evidence that the protests, raves and crowded beaches that we've seen in recent weeks, where people haven't been obeying social distancing rules, have led to an uptick in infections?
Well, Harry, I think we're sticking to what we're saying on face coverings, which is, look, when you're in a crowded space where you're with people that you don't normally come into contact with, the tube is an obvious example, but shops is another one, then you should wear a face covering. But Patrick and Chris, is anything you want to say?
I'm going to let Chris deal with the yard of ale, but the uptick of infections, we haven't seen anything from those sorts of events yet. Doesn't mean we won't, but there's been nothing that's been seen yet. And the same is true actually in some other countries where outdoor events have taken place. There hasn't yet been any indication we've had an uptick, but it's obviously something that needs to be looked for. And I'm sure Chris will comment again on alcohol and doing things safely and sensibly.
Well, I seem to remember that Mr. Rees-Mogg said that he was going to buy the yard, but didn't say he would drink it. People clearly need to stick to the usual kind of sensible guidelines on drinking and enjoy it.
Yeah. And I can tell you that I will certainly buy and drink a pint, but not a yard. And I really do just repeat the message to everybody. This is a big turning point for us. We've got to get it right. Let's work together and enjoy summer safely. Thanks, everybody.
So that's the end of the briefing for today. But let's recap on what was said in the press conference led by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He promised to publish a timetable next week for the reopening of businesses, including indoor gyms, nail bars, swimming pools. He reiterated the plan to move away from blanket national measures to local targeted lockdowns, with the possibility of temporarily shutting individual businesses. He urged people to act safely and sensibly this weekend when pubs and restaurants reopen tomorrow in England, and he warned that we're not out of the woods yet and that he would not hesitate to impose restrictions again. Well, our medical correspondent Fergus Walsh is here, and Fergus, the R rate was once again mentioned, below 1 nationally, but it's a variable picture across the country.
It is across the UK. It's still standing, according to the experts, at somewhere between 0.7 and 0.9. So each infected person passing it on to just under one person. But we can look at the figures, and around the UK, or around England, it is variable. Now, in London, we've got a figure of 0.8, a range of 0.8 to 1.1, so just potentially just over 1. But when the cases of coronavirus start to fall, R in some ways becomes less important. What's important is the incidence and prevalence of the disease, and we're seeing about just under 1,000 cases being confirmed each day, but that probably means we're missing maybe another 1,000 or 2,000, and there's a shrinkage of somewhere between 2 to 5% of cases being picked up each day. So the epidemic in the UK is still shrinking in most areas. There are some rises, places like Leicester, but we have far fewer infections than we had, say, a month ago.
But we're still being asked to be vigilant. There are still measures that we've got to take account of, even though things are changing, because we could see these lockdowns happen locally, which people really won't want.
No, absolutely. And the advice on the 1 metre plus, which comes in England tomorrow, which is staying at least 1 metre apart with other mitigating measures. You heard very much the mood from the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor. There is caution. Chris Whitty said this virus is going to be with us for a very, very long time. And if people don't obey the social distancing and they just act like coronavirus doesn't exist anymore, then we will start to see an uptick. And so this only works if people obey the social distancing. So from tomorrow in England, 2 families will be able to be together indoors, 2 households, as long as they maintain social distancing, and outdoors, up to 6 people from different households.
Fergus, for the moment, thank you very much. Hard to keep track of it all, isn't it, when it changes? Well, you will recall that the government today has issued a list of countries that people can travel from England to and back again without having to socially self-isolate and go into quarantine for 2 weeks, as previously had happened. But some of the countries that you might have expected to be on the list are not. One of them is Portugal. And the Portuguese Foreign Ministry has said on Twitter today, it's absurd that a country, the United Kingdom, which has 28 times more deaths than Portugal due to COVID-19, impose quarantine on passengers from Portugal. They clearly don't think this is a sensible thing to have done. The United States is one of the other countries that also isn't free of those restrictions yet. Well, the pubs may be reopening, cinemas as well from tomorrow, but theatres still have no date for to reopen for performances or any live entertainment venue for that matter. There's been a statement issued from the National Theatre in London, a very big institution, of course. It says, we've committed to paying our casual staff until the end of August, but very sadly, due to the changes in the government retention scheme, we simply cannot afford to offer financial support beyond that point when we won't be back performing as usual. This is the job retention scheme, which of course supported organisations, businesses to keep paying their staff something. We hope, it says, that additional financial support from the government may be forthcoming to allow the National Theatre to begin performing again in a limited way. However, it's set to be months before it'll be possible to perform to audiences in our usual capacity. So regrettably, a proportion of job losses are unavoidable. That a statement from the National Theatre. Well, our political correspondent Jessica Parker was watching that press conference that was led today by Boris Johnson, and as you said, a request for people to be sensible as we move to the next set of changes.
Yeah, I think a real effort to try and get people to engage with the fact that we are moving to a new phase of dealing with coronavirus. I think one of the things that was quite striking from what Boris Johnson was saying, and the scientific and chief medical officer, that local lockdowns will happen going forward. So, of course, we've seen the most drastic type of local lockdown, of course, in Leicester, but very much warning that that will be something that we could see. I think the phrase was used, a feature of our lives going forward. And I think what the government is desperately trying to avoid, and the Prime Minister making this very clear, they don't want to go back to a national lockdown, particularly because of the damage that does to the economy, and with an enhanced monitoring system they'll be better able to detect local outbreaks and therefore crack down on those local outbreaks rather than having to shut down the entire economy. Having said that, of course, there has been a lot of criticism about the test and trace programme that the government's rolled out. Strong suggestions that really that's not in the place that it needs to be going forward. But I think clearly as pubs reopen in England tomorrow, hairdressers as well, there is just this balance of risk that ministers are trying to strike, but make it very clear at the press conference today that risk is still very much there in terms of coronavirus. The virus has not gone away, as has been demonstrated by Leicester. So whilst we have got this easing of lockdown, people do continue to need to be careful.
Jessica, for the moment, thank you very much. Jessica Parker in Westminster. Well, there were more than 29,000 extra deaths in care homes in England and Wales up to the second week of June compared to the previous year. That's according to new figures from the Office for National Statistics. Nearly 20,000 of those deaths involved confirmed or suspected coronavirus infections, with the highest number of people dying in South East England. The data come in advance of the introduction next week of routine testing for staff and residents in care homes. Here's our health correspondent Dominic Hughes.
The toll the coronavirus outbreak has taken in care homes is becoming ever clearer. Official figures show an extra 29,000 deaths in care homes in England and Wales between March and June compared to the same period last year. The data is exposing just how vulnerable elderly residents were to the virus and will lead to questions about what more could have been done to protect them.
We'll have to go back and look at exactly what happened, and I bitterly regret every single loss of life that we've had.
There's new data too on how infections spread through care homes. A survey of around 5,000 care homes in England and Wales revealed that more than half have seen coronavirus infections. In those homes, on average, a fifth of residents became infected with the virus, and 7% of staff also tested positive. The data also suggests that in those care homes where staff received sick pay or employed fewer temporary agency staff, infection rates were lower.
It's really no surprise that in care homes where staff don't have guaranteed full pay when they're off sick, and where there's a high number of agency and temporary staff, that infection rates were higher. We know that if you provide proper training, if you have well-supported staff with full access to full sick pay, then you reduce the likelihood that anybody who is feeling unwell will come to work. And obviously that's really important in controlling the spread of COVID.
From Monday, testing for the virus in care homes in England will be stepped up. Staff will be tested each week, residents every 28 days, in an effort to prevent the spread of coronavirus in social care. But there are concerns that agency staff who may come and go from homes will be missed.
We really welcome the government's decision today to go for whole home testing, but agency staff aren't included in that unless they are actually in the home at the point at which the testing is taking place. And that's a real cohort who needs to be included within the new testing regime on a weekly basis.
More testing in care homes has been welcomed, but the figures released today suggest far more could and should have been done to protect the most vulnerable. Dominic Hughes, BBC News.
Let's get some reaction to the changes to the lockdown measures then, and how the public might adjust to these changes. The public being us, of course. Professor Steve Reicher is a social psychologist from the University of St Andrews and sits on an advisory group on behavioural science, which supports the government's scientific advisory group, SAGE. Thank you very much for joining us. How clear is the messaging that we should be following from tomorrow in England?
Well, I think the difficulty is that actions often speak much louder than words. And the things that were said at the press conference today, I completely agree with. I completely agree with the statement which says we're not out of this pandemic. There's still a deadly pandemic going on and the virus is out there. That we need to be extremely careful and cautious, that quite frankly, that pubs are risky environments. They're perfect environments for the virus. They're indoors, they're warm, people will be close together. And sadly, as people drink and their inhibitions go, so even the small restrictions there are might disappear. So those messages which say be careful, I completely and utterly agree with. However, the wider messaging, I think, isn't quite as clear. The first question is, why on earth were the restrictions raised on a Saturday and July the 4th? They play completely into the hands of those who want to talk in terms of freedom and independence and Super Saturday, and they work against moderation and they work against constraints. So first of all, I don't understand the timing at all. And the second thing is, well, a few of us watch press conferences and a few of us hear that message. However, that's completely outweighed by the number of people who don't see that messaging, but who see the pubs open and see people close together and think, well, if they're opening the pubs, well, that tells us it can't be that dangerous, can it? So in many ways, actions speak louder than words. And the danger is that the positive messages we heard today are drowned out by the actions and by the lifting of restrictions at a time when still infections are in the thousands every day, and we still don't have a fully functional test, trace and isolate system. So I think we need to be very careful. Now, what's going to happen tomorrow is going to happen tomorrow. Well, it's not going to stop now. So that makes it even more important that we're incredibly vigilant, that we look very carefully and work with localities to spot early any increases in infection, and also that we give people all the information they need in order to understand what they're meant to do if they get symptoms, where they're supposed to go if they are to be tested, the need to give contacts and the need to isolate. And again, that messaging is not as clear as it should be.
We've seen, though, what has happened when the infection rate and the number of cases went up in places like Leicester. There was a reversal. There was a localised lockdown. How useful is that in reminding people that there are still rules that they have to comply with?
Well, the first thing is, in Leicester, it was left far too late. that the number of infections at postcode level, so you could actually intervene and find out where the hotspots were, that information was not passed on to local health teams. When it came to taking action to a so-called lockdown, the mayor was only informed at the very last minute. And I think it's very important, in fact, it's crucial that we have early identification, that we work with localities, and we work through local health protection schemes. And the other thing is this. I think the word lockdown and the term lockdown is very unhelpful because it's punitive. It suggests it's like a prison. It suggests you've done something wrong. What I think is absolutely critical is that when there are increases in infection, you bring in support. You don't punish people, you support them. You support them with increased testing, with increased information, and also increased material support, resources, so people can actually isolate and lock down. Because it's all very well talking about testing and tracing, but testing alone and tracing alone do nothing at all. They're only functional if they get people to isolate, and people can only isolate if it's practically possible. So if you live in a multi-generational household, how on earth are you meant to lock down safely, especially if there are vulnerable people? Where is the accommodation to help those people out? If you are going to lose wages, if you're going to lose your livelihood and money by locking down, how do you expect people to lock down? And we heard a very cautionary tale in your last piece about care homes, where the evidence showed that if you didn't have full sick pay, if people lost wages by going off sick, then they were more likely to stay at work, more likely to spread the infection, more people were likely to die. So those levels of support, I think we shouldn't be talking in terms of lockdown. I think we should be talking in terms of bringing in tailored local forms of support. And in that context, people will be much more willing to go along with any restrictions that are necessary.
Professor Stephen Reischer from the University of St Andrews and a member of SAGE, thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News and BBC One. Let's recap then from the press conference today, which was led by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He promised to publish a timetable next week for the reopening of businesses including indoor gyms, nail bars and swimming pools. He went on to reiterate the plan to move away from blanket national measures to local targeted lockdowns, with the possibility of temporarily shutting individual businesses. The Prime Minister also urged people to act safely and sensibly this weekend when pubs and restaurants reopen tomorrow in England. And he warned that we're not out of the woods yet and that he wouldn't hesitate to impose restrictions again. Much more analysis of all of those announcements that have been made by the government today, including those air bridges, those air corridors of where people can travel to without having to quarantine. Coming up here on BBC News. Time for the weather now with Nick.
Hello, cloudy, wet, very wet for some, windy, about to get windier over the weekend. Let's take a look at how the rest of Friday and the weekend is shaping up. Starting by looking back at this morning in Cumbria, already some heavy rain into here, and for much of Scotland as well, heaviest in the southwest, rain at times for Northern Ireland, northern and western England and Wales, and spreading further southeast as the day goes on. Now, there will be some areas of Scotland that see some breaks in the rain occasionally right at the end of the afternoon towards the northwest, for example, 20 to 30 millimetres of rain in southwest Scotland, more on hills, there could be some disruption. Wet at times then for Northern Ireland, the rain for western England and Wales, heaviest and most persistent into the hills, occasional rain for northeast England and the Midlands, and then feeding into East Anglia and across much of southern England then as we go through the late afternoon and into the evening. And it is windy throughout as well, parts of Wales, the Midlands, seeing some gusts perhaps in excess of 40 miles per hour. Some occasional rain staying for many overnight, but notice how northern Scotland is turning drier, a bit clearer as well and cooler. But notice also how temperatures hold up across much of England, and for Wales, quite a warm and muggy night to come with plenty of cloud, low clouds, so some mistiness around coast and into the hills. And we keep a lot of that cloud tomorrow again with some occasional outbreaks of rain, not necessarily raining everywhere all the time. And if you you're to the east of high ground, you may just see a few sunnier breaks. It is still windy out there, but if you do get to see some sunshine, temperatures may end up a little bit higher than this, though most of us will not see that sun and stay cloudy. Now, problems Saturday night into Sunday with the area of low pressure, which moves just close to Scotland on the southern flank of that. A bit of uncertainty about how strong the winds will be, but it does look windier into Sunday for many of us. But we also see a cold front moving southwards, taking away this cloudy, humid air. And so actually on Sunday, for many, it's going to brighten up. There'll be showers, heaviest into Scotland, some thundering for parts of Northern Ireland as well. But again, those winds pick up overnight and into the day. For parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England, we could well see some gusts 50 to 60 miles per hour. So there could be some disruption because of the winds in places on Sunday. So we are going to keep you updated with that as we get closer to Sunday. It may turn out to be even a bit windier. It will start to feel a bit cooler and fresher though from the north on Sunday.